this literally could happen to any parent.
Has your inbox just been flooded?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
We've heard from, I would say probably now 700 families across America who say that some version of this has happened to them.
That and so much more coming right up on today's episode of The Pod Spotter. You've been listening to yet another riveting conversation on The Pod Spotter, you lucky dog. Guys, have you actually seen the number of podcasts out there? Don't even look. Just meet me here every Monday. I'm going to have a brand new podcast for you to slip on and try out before you drive it off the lot. And hopefully you find our conversation useful and entertaining. And if you do, please tell people to subscribe to our pod. Word of mouth really helps. Visit thepodspotter.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at thepodspotter for extra content and info on upcoming shows. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. It's really a pleasure. I've been screening hundreds of podcasts. It was 1 a.m. and my wife was sound asleep. We split shifts with the new baby. I worked late, so I was on daddy duty till 2 a.m. My daughter was 4 months old at the time and was having one of her inconsolable crying sessions, which meant I had to call in the big guns, the yoga ball. My wife and I spent more time bouncing our daughter to sleep on that yoga ball during the first 6 months of her life than either one of us had ever before in the previous 10 years of owning it. So much so that the yoga ball had begun to develop an egg-like shape. Its oblong contortion meant you had to be a little more careful bouncing on it because it would roll around beneath you as its dimensions began to warp. On this particular evening, I'd forgotten that fateful rule, and while bouncing my child in my arms, the now oval-shaped, underinflated workout ball shifted beneath me mid-bounce. I came down on the skinny side, which propelled me backwards, head first, into a tall IKEA shelving unit. Next, my back hit some combination of the shelf and the floor as I instinctively allowed my arms to prioritize the precious bundle I carried over bracing for impact. When I hit the ground, I quickly rolled over to my knees in case my fall had jostled anything loose from the upper shelves. I was in pain, but my baby was okay. I'll never forget how quickly it happened. This seemingly simple task of bouncing a child had turned violently dangerous in the snap of a finger. Any parent knows on any given day you avoid catastrophe nearly every waking minute you're looking after an infant or toddler. The most accurate description of early parenthood I've ever heard was when a friend called it suicide watch. Your job is to run around all day making sure tiny dumb people don't hurt themselves. I was lucky to get out of that situation with a few bumps and bruises. But what if I had ended up in the hospital? What if I hadn't been the only one to sustain injury that evening? As you will learn from the hit podcast Do No Harm, a co-production of NBC News and Wondery, a harmless accident can turn into a parent's worst nightmare very quickly. When Melissa Bright's 5-month-old takes a tumble from a lawn chair and hits his head, her family is thrust into a medical and legal system so focused on protecting children from abuse, it has targeted innocent parents. Joining me to discuss Do No Harm is NBC News national investigative reporter Mike Hixenbaugh, alongside the subject of his podcast, wife, mother of two, and social activist Melissa Bright. Thank you for being here, both of you, and thanks for sharing the pod.
Thank you, Zach. That was fantastic introduction. Wow.
We're all parents here. Let's start with how are the babies? How is everyone's kids doing? Mike, you have 4. Melissa, you have 2. Still 3. Just 2? Yeah. 3 now. Congratulations on your 3rd. I have 1. I just have 1. I'm low man on the totem pole here. My daughter's doing fine. How's everyone's babies doing?
Sassier by the year. Mason just turned 3, and I think 3 is harder than 2. They say terrible 2s, but they really mean terrible.
Well,
I love that name, by the way. Mason, is that a family name? Such a good name.
Well, his middle name, Dean, is. So
Okay.
Dean is after his my husband's dad. So
Got it. And how are your babies, Mike? I'm one of four. I know the chaos that you live with.
My wife just had to leave town last week for a family medical emergency, and I was home with all four of them while working. So living what a lot of people have been living during this pandemic. And I have a great text that I wish I could just bring it up right now, where there was a moment where I was on a Zoom call and I texted my wife to say, I just glanced out the window. I'm on a work call. Felix, the 2-year-old's in the backyard, and his diaper's around his ankle. And pardon my language, but in the text I wrote, "Shit is smeared everywhere." And meanwhile, the 5 and 7-year-olds are slapping each other in like an escalation of their ongoing battle over these colored pens that they've been using. And so we're much better now because their mom is home and we can juggle. But yeah, it's a constant adventure. Yeah.
Let's hope there's not a sequel to Do No Harm here coming up. My goodness.
Yeah.
I liked the Suicide Watch. I felt that.
You've heard that, right? You've heard this.
I've never heard it, but I will.
You've lived it.
You've lived it. Yeah. Melissa, I just want to echo a sentiment that I'm sure you've heard a lot, and that is to say that as a parent, I just had a knot in my stomach the entire time listening to this podcast, listening to your story unfold. I couldn't breathe at some moments, and at one point, because I was like sighing so much, my wife was like, "You're taking a break from this one." She cut me off. She was like, "You got to put this one down for a minute." And if that's what, listeners feel, I can only imagine obviously what life was like for you enduring it. So that's all just to say again, thank you for, reliving these moments and talking to us today. And I know that it comes at a cost to have to go back and revisit these things. So thank you once again. Mike, maybe just an intro from you and a little bit about your background in reporting on healthcare before the podcast came along.
I started at really small newspapers, and I kind of scratched my way up, working, covering cop shifts and, writing 6 stories a day type work. And eventually I got to the Houston Chronicle, where, I was on the investigative team. I covered healthcare and investigated hospitals. That's kind of my background. And in the November-December timeframe of 2019, my wife was actually about to go into labor. I remember I got a text from a colleague at the Houston Chronicle named Carrie Blakinger who said, "You won't believe the story I'm working on. Do you want to investigate CPS with me?" And the case she was talking about was Dylan and Melissa Bright. She was following it through the court process. And I remember texting Carrie back like, "That sounds cool. My wife's about to go into labor. Let's talk in a month." And so that was kind of the beginning of how we got into this. And the reason she contacted me is because there's it's a legal story, but it's also a medical story. And, as I started to take a look at what was going on here, essentially CPS, Child Protective Services, relies on this subspecialty of physicians called child abuse pediatricians, which I'd never heard of, but they're at pretty much every major children's hospital, and their job is to look at a child, especially children too young to speak for themselves, look at their injuries, and look at the science and determine whether or not those injuries could have been an accident like the parents maybe have described, or are they too serious and maybe they're inflicted. And the reality is science isn't that exact in these cases. And so we started digging and finding that these doctors, when they report that a child's injuries look like abuse, that often moves quickly toward CPS coming and taking children from parents. And we started to find cases where, accidents can mimic abuse, and it's really difficult for someone who wasn't there to know. And so that was the start of like a year-long investigation of not just Melissa and Dylan Bright's cases, but dozens across Texas and eventually across the country.
Can you carve out, Mike, just because it's used a lot on your pods, CPS and CAPS, maybe just carve out the difference between those two, because that can get confusing, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. So CPS is the one everyone's probably familiar with. Child Protective Services. These are state social workers whose job is to keep children safe. And so, if there are parents who and caregivers who abuse or neglect their children. And so as a society, CPS comes in and they are supposed to investigate to determine if it's in the child's best interest to stay in that home, or maybe they need to be removed and placed in foster care. And so CPS relies on this field of child abuse pediatricians. So you'll hear people say the CAP team at the hospital. And so if there's a serious injury case, CPS will rely on whatever medical opinion that the CAP team gives them to make a determination about where the child should go, or what they should do, or whether the state should file criminal charges as well.
And Melissa, how about an introduction from you as well, and maybe a little bit about your life pre-Do No Harm?
So I had my daughter in 2016. She made me a mom, and I worked after I had her. And when we were about to have Mason, we sat down and we kind of weighed the cost. Is it worth me to keep working, or will it just pay for childcare? And we decided that I'd stay home after he was born. And so my husband worked. It's actually always been my dream to be a stay-at-home mom. And by God's grace, we were able to afford that life for me and our family. And so I got to stay home with Mason and Charlotte. And that was kind of life before, it was just, we had one, so why not add two? And now why not add three? But Mike, I don't think we're going to get to a fourth. Three is good. So that was kind of life before this accident. And then, what every mom does in an accident, you immediately have an injured kid and you seek medical attention. And I had no idea that there was even such a thing as child abuse pediatricians.
Yeah, it was definitely news to me, the interplay between the two.
The field of child abuse pediatrics is only about a decade old. And for decades before that, there would be physicians at children's hospitals whose job was to assess injuries like this. But this was a decade ago. The American Academy of Pediatrics came together and created this new medical subspecialty where they would create a fellowship where these physicians would be trained in these different areas to examine a child's injuries and determine, like I said, if they look to be abuse or not abuse. And what we found in our reporting was, since then, a lot of these child abuse pediatricians that are based at major children's hospitals, their programs are funded through state grants and grants from sometimes district attorneys' offices, and they work at the hospital, they're doctors, but they work closely with law enforcement and child protective services. And so, lots of the parents we talked to had no idea when they're rushing to a hospital, they have an injured baby, they were bouncing on that ball like you were, and the head is smashed, and they're panicked and they rush to the hospital. They don't realize that at some point, one of the social workers or physicians who's sitting down with them is taking notes potentially for a CPS referral. And those notes are fed directly to Child Protective Services in the form of an affidavit.
This is triggered automatically. This automatically goes into effect when a child goes in.
They make a call if the injuries appear serious. Not every kid who shows up in an ER is going to go down this path, but in the case of if you have a serious head injury, or it appears there's been some sort of trauma to their head, there's a good chance that you're going to get referred for a child abuse evaluation. And these doctors are not required to, sometimes they do, but often they don't, say, here's who I am, and here's what I'm going to do with this information. There's no Miranda right. There's no, you're just talking to a doctor and you can talk with Melissa. Often the parents think this is part of the treating team, and these doctors aren't really treating physicians. They're running an investigation.
I just helped a good friend of mine. Her sister had a son. He was 8 months old, fell off the bed, has one broken clavicle bone. She had to go through an entire child abuse pediatrician evaluation, take her kids, both of them, in for full body x-rays and all of this unnecessary stuff over a single fracture from a single event. And they have to verify it wasn't child abuse. And so they put him through all of this rigorous testing, blood test, scans, x-rays to make sure. And so I feel like now it's almost become this thing where if any child has any type of fracture, whether they do or do not believe it could have happened from the event a parent is stating, they use it as a gateway just to make sure. And I feel like that's an invasion of privacy, not only for the child, but for the parents as well.
In your case, Melissa, it was this moment, drying off your daughter when Mason's put, on a chair. And it's that sentiment in your podcast that's terrifying about how quickly life can change in a split second. It's really sort of the cautionary tale of this pod, and it's articulated, I think, beautifully by your hubby Dylan in episode 1.
Never in our history together have I ever heard my wife make those kind of noises. To be in such a panic, it's just this menagerie of yelling and screaming and crying, and I immediately knew that something was wrong.
Mike sort of touched on it, but Melissa, I'm wondering for our listeners if you'd be willing to run through in as much or as little detail as you'd like the sort of next 24, 48 hours for you from that experience on.
Everything kind of felt out of body, if you will. When we got to the hospital, it didn't feel like my life. It felt like, watching an episode of Law and Order or Criminal Minds or something like that. They immediately rushed us back for scans, and then nobody even came to tell us the results of those scans. It was like we didn't know if he was going to be okay. We didn't know if we were going to have to go to surgery. We didn't know anything, and they didn't share with us that he had the 2 fractures. They didn't share with us he had the subdural hematoma. Eventually, a social worker came and asked me down the hall, and I just thought it was normal hospital protocol, kids injured, social workers involved. Honestly, when they said a social worker wanted to talk to me, I thought it was for me. Like, hey, your child's been injured. You might need some help, some assistance. Let's take a break. Let's take a breather. And so we walked down the hall and she closed the door, and it was a moment of silence. It was not the beeping and the sounds and staring at the machines and, the nurses and doctors in and out. I could finally take a breath, and she kind of asked me what happened. And I told her exactly what had happened just before then. And she wasn't really forthcoming with any information or whatever. I guess it was just a moment to process. And then she told me that an ambulance had to take us to the downtown facility. The Woodlands location of Texas Children's doesn't have a neurosurgery department, but the downtown location does. And that she sent me back into the room with Mason and my husband. I got to ride with Mason, and my poor husband had to follow. So he didn't know. We didn't know, was he going to die on this trip? Was he being rushed down for some type of surgery? Was what extent were his injuries? He didn't know anything, and he had to be absent from it and drive himself down there. So while we were down there, we immediately get put into this trauma emergency room. And there was probably a good 10, 12 people in that room, different people asking me questions like, what happened? How did it happen? Oh, he fell from a park bench. And I'd be like, no, it wasn't a park bench. I don't know if they were cross communicating their stories or if they were trying to get me to slip. I don't know the scenario. All I know is I'm sitting in this room. I even had to pull up a chair because I thought I was going to pass out. There was so much commotion, everybody poking and prodding my kid. I guess they got the information they need, and they put us in a smaller emergency room, I guess, where we waited to be admitted. And during that time, they had a monitor who had to come and sit with us. So the whole time, there's this person that we don't know that doesn't communicate with us, that I don't remember her name. I don't remember even so much as saying more than hi to her. And she had to sit in the room right next to Mason. And it was like she was staring at him breathing. And so at this point, still, I don't know anything about my kid. I haven't seen a single scan. I don't know, why are we just sitting in an emergency room? Are we going to surgery? Are we not going to surgery? What is even going on? And this woman is sitting here watching my son's chest rise and fall. Eventually, around midnight or so, we were brought up to our room. They allowed Dylan and I to stay in the room with Mason. And I just stared at the machine to make sure his oxygen levels were good and his heart rate was steady. And I finally got to process. That was like the first time Dylan and I had even a second where it was just the two of us, or, the two of us and Mason, to even go through what had happened that day.
You mentioned in that moment, or sorry, I think it's the moment before, in that moment of silence, you mentioned like, this is the first silence I've heard like all day. I think you like actually say that. And it's, as the listener, we're like, oh my gosh, they're going to use that against her. Like people are evaluating her and she doesn't know that people are evaluating
No,
her.
I had no idea.
I think that's the most terrifying thing for, you want to just convince these people that are evaluating you that you're crazy and that you're not crazy, that you're capable of taking care of your child. And so like but that comes at a cost. Then you're complying too much and you feel like you're not fighting enough. And I kind of hear that sentiment a lot on your pod here. You just like, you were thanking people for things that they were doing, for rights that they were taking from you, basically, in an attempt to look, I'm a normal person. I'm just trying to comply. I'm just taking care of my kids. Do you wish in some of these moments that you were fighting more, or that you were vocal more to CPS as they are trying to take character assessments in front of you?
So the initial, I guess, report to CPS came from a nurse in our first emergency room in the Woodlands. And I feel like it is a parent's right to know from that moment, hey, we've contacted CPS, because I would have started recording in that moment. I should have had the right to choose to do that, because I didn't know I needed to protect myself. And by the time I started recording, what information did I miss? I mean, I'm sitting here in the most traumatic state of my life, not knowing what is going on with my child. And I can't remember every single detail of that. I should have been at least provided the right to record. So I don't understand what all the secrecy was about. If when they made that call, they should have said, hey, Mrs. Bright, you're acting suspicious. I don't know. Yeah. We've contacted CPS for this reason, and they chose not to do that.
What was it like hearing Dylan's conversations on the pod and his interviews with Mike? Like, had you had time to sort of process all of that and get it out between yourselves, or did you learn anything from listening to the podcast, listening to your story as a whole? Did you learn anything new about your husband?
I feel a little sad saying this, but I didn't realize the trauma Dylan went through. I mean, we went through the same traumas, but I had the trauma of having to call 911 and riding in the ambulance, and I experienced what I experienced, but I also didn't kind of take a step back and realize how traumatic it was for him experiencing it differently. Like, I got to be in the ambulance, and as traumatic as that was, I can't imagine riding in the car behind it, not knowing what's going on with my wife or my child on the inside. And I don't think he's ever really clearly portrayed that to me. So hearing it in the podcast for the first time was, it made my heart sad.
Mike, you start the podcast with sharing your yoga ball story, your worst day with your daughter. Again, this, playful moment that quickly turns. Why was it important for you to share that story?
When I first heard the Bright story and other stories like it, my thought was I could relate. I could put myself in their shoes as a parent, because we all want to protect our kids. So the story you're referring to is, how many dads have done this? I was swinging my little, at the time, 2-year-old daughter by her hands and not realizing that it could potentially pop her elbows out of place. And one of her elbows did pop out of place, and it's not a major injury, but it scared the hell out of me. And so we took her to the doctor, and I thought about that story a lot, because in hindsight, if it had been more serious, if it had been a different type of injury, if my wife hadn't witnessed it, then what different path could I have gone down? And so I wanted people to hear, one, I'm telling you this story. I'm not just some, monotone narrator. I'm a human. I'm a parent, and my identity as a dad is shaping how I'm telling you this story. And also trying to create an opportunity for everyone who's listening, who either has a kid or loves kids, to imagine themselves in a situation like that. And it's amazing how every conversation I've had about this podcast, people connect with that story and the one I tell later in the podcast about when I did drop my son, later in the midst of reporting this. everyone responds to that just like you did with their own story. Like, yeah, because we've all screwed up. We've all made this mistake. And Melissa, she'll tell you, and some of the criticism she's gotten since the podcast has come out, yeah, in hindsight, would she have left the baby on the lawn chair for 30 seconds, knowing that he might be able to kick off? No. But as a parent, I can relate to that. I would have totally done that to grab a naked 2-year-old and to wrap her up and get her dried off. Like, that's just what you do.
Yeah.
And then we discover in their story potentially this additional layer of terror. It's worse because now not only is your kid seriously injured, but they're looking at you potentially as a suspect. And it's based on a medical opinion, something that's going to be difficult for you to refute. Like, it's your story against the doctors. And so, this podcast is about one case. It's about 2 cases. And we can get into that more about the other case that becomes intertwined with theirs, with the Brights. But this is happening all over the country. I've written numerous stories about cases like this from across the country during the course of our investigation. And it is, I don't want to overstate this, but I think it's accurate that this literally could happen to any parent.
Has your inbox just been flooded?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We've heard from, I would say probably now 700 families across America who say that some version of this has happened to them. Look, I want to make one quick caveat, which is that people do abuse their kids and these doctors are correct often. And so I have no way of knowing of those 700 people, how many of their stories are legitimate, how many of them are, actually child abusers who are just pleading their case. But I've looked at a number of their stories. I've reviewed dozens of them. And often there's compelling evidence that there wasn't abuse. But as you'll see in the podcast, there's compelling evidence that Melissa didn't abuse her kid either. Like the CPS, everything in their investigation pointed to them not being child abusers. The only thing that pointed in a different direction was the doctor's report from the child abuse pediatrician that said, 2 skull fractures and subdural bleeding in a child from a short fall on concrete it's more serious than what you'd expect, and therefore it's consistent with abuse.
I think you do a nice job of not, vilifying anyone too much and explaining, it's easy to sit here and complain about CAPS taking away our rights and being too invasive, but then, you set up sort of both sides of the story beautifully with the Richardson case.
Tonight, the Amber Alert for a missing 3-year-old Richardson girl with special needs has expired. But police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals Service continue searching.
Good morning to you. I'm Katie Blakey. We begin with that breaking news in the Sharon Matthews case.
It's just hard to imagine.
This is just so senseless.
Worse when you see the hole there.
It almost feels like I lost one of my own kids.
Mike, could you tell us about the Richardson girl and how her story is connected to the Brights and other families, these 700 families that you've heard from?
So that tape was from the Sharon Matthews case in 2017. It's the story of this little 3-year-old girl who went missing, and turns out she had been killed and discarded in a drainage ditch outside of Dallas. And the story made national and international news, and it led to changes at CPS. And so because in her case, the girl had previously been to a hospital with some injuries, and a child abuse pediatrician in Dallas reviewed her injuries and concluded they looked suspicious. And so it was after that CPS looked at the case, but decided, no, I think the parents are taking good care of her, and they returned her to her adoptive parents. And then she went missing, and then she was found dead. And so there was a huge uproar, hearings at the Texas legislature about the case, lawmakers demanding that this never happen again. And what we found in our reporting is that they made policy changes in Texas. So when a CPS worker gets a report from a child abuse pediatrician, they now have to give it even more credence and more weight, automatically elevating it to a higher level, getting their supervisors involved. And it was in that context that Dylan and Melissa Bright walked into a hospital with Mason.
Yeah.
In our reporting, we found that the Sharon Matthews case really put CPS on alert that when you get a report from one of these doctors, these are our experts. And instead of the child abuse pediatrician's report being the beginning of an investigation to see if there's abuse, in many cases, it becomes the investigation. The doctor said it's likely abuse. It is abuse. We're removing these kids.
And that is a point I think that, is it Rhonda Carson, a former CPS supervisor, actually cops up to. She actually admits to in episode 6.
And I hate to say this, but I feel like, and I've always felt like, those decisions to remove a child a lot of times are not done in the best interest of the child. I'd just rather remove the child so nothing comes back on me. And that is wrong. That is so wrong. And that is traumatizing to the child. That's traumatizing to the family. When a good, thorough investigation should guide your decisions. Nobody will ever admit to that.
Melissa, we are going to learn also in episode 2 that your children will be taken from you after this investigation. You're going to lose Mason and Charlotte. And I just need to ask, like, what? Are you a religious person? Like, I need to know what got you through that time in your life.
Well, if you don't believe in God, going through that experience will definitely make you. Honestly, it was something that you don't ever think is going to happen. And that even when it was happening, it felt like it wasn't going to happen. Like it just, like, why does that happen? How does that happen to kids? Why was that happening to Mason and Charlotte? Maybe that's something you read somewhere else, but certainly doesn't happen in real life. And anyway, it was, again, I felt like I was outside looking in on it, and it took me a long time to sift through those emotions and process through them.
Let's see, you mentioned earlier that you'd wish you'd recorded more, and maybe you would advise people now to record more, but you have a lot, actually. You have many conversations recorded. How did you know to do that? How did you think to do that in those moments?
I think part of that is my husband is who he is. He just is who he is. He felt something was off, and so he chose to record. And then I also got some pretty sound advice from a family friend. They work for a program called Loving Houston. It's a foster adoption agency. And she's been through some similar type cases, I think, that anybody in the field has. And she was just like, you need to be reporting.
I do want to listen to some of the audio of the day that CPS agents came, but I do want to warn listeners that this is very raw, and you will hear a family in crisis mode.
What grounds was this emergency hearing based on?
Again, sir, the hearing is October 3rd. I've already explained the reason for the emergency.
Well, I'm just asking.
That's when the reality of the situation began to set in for Melissa. Her children were going away. She didn't know where or for how long, and she was powerless to stop it. There was nothing they could do. Charlotte, the 2-year-old, could tell something was wrong. She tried to comfort her mom.
Mommy! I'm happy.
I'm happy, Mommy, Charlotte said. I'm happy.
It's the two sounds I can't get out of my head since listening to your pod is Charlotte trying to calm you down, and then your son, when he's finally returned, the wheezing. It's unbelievable that you have these, and good on Dylan for just having the presence of mind to record them. Were they used in court eventually? Would they use? Yeah, they'd use everything.
Yeah, so we didn't even hire an attorney until after our kids were taken. So, I mean, we had no idea they would ever be used in a court of law because we didn't ever think it'd go that way. But yeah, they were used in court. A lot of it was to kind of catch the supervisor or the caseworker for what they were saying on the stand versus what they actually said in reality.
You start with that caseworker, Mike. You start from his perspective. The whole podcast begins, and it's sort of disorienting because you're like, whose story is this? Who am I rooting for here? And quickly, we are not rooting for the social worker and LeVar in this case, but was that intentional to just sort of set up there are both two sides to this, and this is a tough job?
Yeah, I think we wanted to begin a little bit with a mystery. I think when you ask anybody who's not taken a close look at the child welfare system, what they think of when they think of Child Protective Services and CPS versus the people that CPS investigates. And automatically, I think most people think CPS is doing important work to protect kids from bad people. And so we wanted to introduce that moment when CPS is coming to protect kids from these people. And I think most people hear that and think, wow, what did these parents do? What did they do to their kids? And that's where the story is going to go. And then obviously we take people in a different direction. We take you back and then kind of really immerse you in their life and all the things that happened to lead up to that moment that we're going to come back to in 2 or 3 episodes.
Talk about what you learned in terms of how hard that job is and the sort of turnover rate of that job. So again, just not to vilify, CPS altogether.
I mean, the job's impossible and important and essential because, children are vulnerable. And as a society, it's not just parents' jobs to protect them. It's it's our society's job to protect them. But, the trouble is CPS only makes the news really when they miss a case of horrible neglect or horrible abuse. And you catch a story about kids who've been living in a cage. There's horrible nightmares, kids like the Sharon Matthews case. And so it sets up this impossible goal. It's a good goal, but it's impossible that we're going to preemptively stop all of this before it happens. And so I think the pressure that these workers are under, the hours that they work for fairly limited money, is just a treadmill and it burns people out. I mean, every CPS worker I've talked to is just like, it is a hard job. And the state has, in Texas and all across the country, they've had to try to deal with that by lowering the standard of people they bring in. Like you don't like in Texas, you don't have to have a social work degree to be a CPS worker. Like as Rhonda talked about, they had people coming in from Enterprise Rent-A-Car you get a 3-week training and then you're out in the field. Like, I mean, you can listen to the audio of LeVar working through the Bright case. You can hear someone who's at times just trying to do their job. And it's a really hard job. And you hear it in the tape during the removal. Why are you taking them? There's no evidence. We have a second opinion that says those injuries would have been the result of the fall. And LeVar just says, yeah, Dylan, but I still got what I got from Texas Children's Hospital. And it just kind of shows that doctor report came in and he's got to follow through on what it says.
I mean, like I say, we have temporary managing conservatorship. That means we have temporary custody. The state of Texas.
Why? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
We say I have all I need. I'm telling you that a proper investigation would have had all the reports. It bothers me that you don't have...
But Dylan, it's still, right. So this doctor, the Julie Mack, right? Again, you guys have this from a second opinion, right? At the end of the day, we still have what we have from Texas Children's Hospital.
You just want to scream. You just want to be like, there is nuance. There is nuance here, and you have to look at every case. But as you said, the training just isn't there. Melissa, you mentioned earlier that you'd lawyered up when they came and took your kids. Would that be your advice to people? Like the minute something like this gets triggered, just get a lawyer right away, or what advice do you give to the moms that email you?
My number one advice is obviously to record. Obviously not every state is the same, but at least in Texas, it's a one-party consent state, so you don't have to notify the other person that you are recording. And then after that, in regards to seeking an attorney, I think that the CPS system is set up to be overly conservative in some matters. For example, you can go through an entire investigation, they get to the end and they can't conclude that it wasn't abuse. And so they push you into family services. And that's not necessarily needed for you or your family based on your certain scenario and an attorney can push your case into a court in which you have a third party overview and it's not just between you and the agency. So obviously my advice is always comply and do what they ask of you, but to probably seek an attorney, and if not retaining one right away, at least know that's a potential direction it could go.
You were able to record so many conversations. Was there something that you were like, I wish I had LeVar saying this, or I wish I had this moment?
I can answer that, actually. Yeah. Sorry, I'm joking. I know the moments that I wish they'd been recording.
If there's ongoing litigation, you don't have to, you can just say pass.
No.
Yeah.
Everything's closed. Everything is done. So there's none of that. There is a specific instance I wish that I had recorded it on the CPS side of things. There was the day we chose to bring our kids back home through our process because they weren't putting the best interest of our child forward. And CPS took that as non-compliance. But really what we were doing is we were in a voluntary plan and we were expressing our voluntary right to say no, not no to the agency, no to our voluntary plan. And it's just misconstrued in the agency. And I wish I had recorded that part.
It's the moment as the listener that you're like, oh, LeVar, this agency is targeting them. It feels targeted. It feels like, oh, because they didn't voluntarily comply, that pissed off some, pencil pusher, and now they're coming for you. They're coming for the kids. Do you feel targeted, or have you made your peace with it at this point? I mean,
it wasn't until obviously when they came to remove the kids that I looked back and at their previous actions and realized that something was off. All of a sudden it was going this one direction and it felt really great. And then something shifted, like the secrecy and the not being forward with the fact that they were going to go to court for removal of our kids. All of that. I don't know what had shifted. At the time, I didn't know what had shifted.
I have to ask you about the courtroom moment when LeVar pleads the fifth over and over again. And then your lawyers decide to not slam dunk and go after him, but to let the case rest, to just not push it because you felt like this is done. Were you and Dylan sitting there must be like, no, attack, go get him. Like, no. Or was it the consensus in the courtroom at the time? Like, okay, he's shown his true colors here.
At that specific hearing, it's called a show cause hearing. And we didn't have custody of our kids at that point. The state still had custody of our kids. So I wasn't like attack. I was like, get my kids home. Yeah. So if they arrested and it meant my kids come home, so be it.
Yeah. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Melissa and Mike. You wouldn't buy a car without driving it or go on a date or two before marrying someone. So why not join me every Monday and sample a podcast or two before you make it all official and add it to your library? Commitment free, no strings attached, just you, me, and the host of an exciting new podcast. If you haven't already, please leave a review on iTunes. Check out our fancy website at thepodspotter.com and tell fellow lovers of pods about what we're doing here. We're playing the field. We're listening to everything. We're shopping around. We're polyamorous, baby. Mike, I have to ask how your work with the Brights has changed the way you parent.
Well, their story and all the others, I think, has certainly inserted into my mind scenarios where I'm more cautious than maybe I would have been otherwise. I wouldn't describe myself as a helicopter parent, but I've become one a little bit. Like when I was recording the final episode of this, I remember coming out and my dog and my toddler ran out the door at the same time, and the dog sideswiped him and he fell and hit his head on the concrete. And my thought was immediately like, one, he should be okay, but he might not be. And so immediately I went inside, picked him up as I'm rubbing his head, and I told my wife in detail, the dog was running out the door. He sideswiped him. He landed like this. He landed here. I took a little picture. Like I have become Yes, I document these things and communicate. Like, you also are aware. Like, here's what happened. And
it's the Melissa Bright effect. Now everything is a crime scene, and you just are making sure everything is accounted for.
My kid had a medical emergency during, when Texas had the big freeze and power outages. In the midst of that, we had a medical emergency for that same kid. He choked on a peanut. It was a kind of a rush to Texas Children's Hospital. And I'm thinking about Dylan and Melissa Bright. And I'm thinking about, like, 2-year-olds aren't supposed to be eating peanuts. Why did I let him do that? And trying to think about, like, on the drive there with my wife, I'm talking through making sure our story is consistent. Not to lie, but I'm like, make sure we're on the same page and we're consistent, because they're looking for inconsistencies in your story. Because that could be a neglectful supervision situation there. And now I talk about recording. As just put my healthcare reporter hat on. Everybody should record all of their interactions with medical professionals. Just do that, because beyond child abuse, there's a lot going on in those conversations, and they're important, and you just are going to want to have them potentially. So
you go to great pains to set up Texas Children's Hospital specifically as an institution that is watching out for this. As a result of Melissa Bright's case, Melissa and Dylan's case, there was reform on the CPS side. That Judge Schneider made sure that there was some retraining for the agents. But was there any reform on the medical side, on the CAPS side, on the Texas medical side?
I do know that our reporting in other places on the same subject has led to, just this week, a child abuse pediatrician who made false statements being removed, but leaving her position and being removed as an expert in Seattle. There was a review that was launched at the Children's Hospital in Milwaukee, and our reporting has launched kind of a national conversation around this in the child abuse pediatrician world. And right now there's a slate of bills in the Texas legislature resulting from our reporting that address these issues, that would attempt to address these issues, including a bill that would require CPS to seek a second medical opinion from a specialist. That's like one of a series of bills that have been introduced to try to find ways to strike the right balance in these cases. Not to throw out the field of child abuse pediatrics or to just say, like, we don't need CPS, but to try to find a way to swing the pendulum a little bit back toward the nuance that we're talking about.
And that's something, Melissa, you guys had actually done. You'd gotten your second opinion.
I feel like I've been the naysayer. I don't disagree with CPS, and I don't disagree with a CAP team. I think it's both necessary. I just think that there's a giant lack of humility when a case goes wrong. Mike had said something in one of the later episodes of Do No Harm. They don't accept any fault. They act like every single diagnosis was the correct one. And that's just not the case. And so I guess my hope is that by getting a second opinion, and maybe they do differ, that these doctors can sit down and educate one another, for the benefit of the child, not for the benefit of the parents or not for the benefit of the state, but for the child. Because sometimes, for example, when I bought a Tahoe, all of a sudden, everybody on the road drove a Tahoe, right? That happens all of the time. And if you're in abuse all of the time, I'm sure that a lot of things constantly look like it. And so what's wrong with a second opinion, a second set of eyes looking at the situation, especially a specialist, and they sit down with the child abuse pediatrician to make sure that that child is best cared for and advocated for.
You kind of mentioned earlier that moms have been reaching out. Would you touch on some of the outreach that you've been doing as a result of this case?
Moms are in a desperate position, and they hope that I'm able to help. And I don't necessarily know if my specific situation is beneficial to them or not, but I can always be a listening ear. And so I try to be, I actually, more than reaching out about specific cases, I had people reaching out telling me they're on episode 2, they're on episode 3, and they can't listen to any more of the podcast until they made sure we were okay. Like, they refused to listen to the rest of Do No Harm until they knew that that we ended up together.
That's a good reminder that I should add that disclaimer right now. Guys, Mason and Charlotte, everyone is great. There's no... Yeah.
Please listen to the whole podcast.
And subscribe to the whole... They're doing fine. Mike's kids, I don't know. I don't know. It's like colored pencil things. It's day by day. I would be remiss if I didn't, bring up the other family in this podcast, Sharday and Lance.
Lance could hear the muffled sound of fireworks popping outside as he lifted Langston into his arms. When he reached the front door, he remembers shifting the baby into his left arm, supporting his head while freeing the other hand to grab the doorknob. That's when he felt Langston start to slip.
And I tried to catch him, and he kind of spun around and hit on his backside and fell back, hit his head.
Mike, what did your podcast reveal to you about the racial inequalities over the course of your reporting?
Interestingly, their child, Langston, through slightly different circumstances, suffered nearly identical injuries as Mason, and showed up at the same hospital as Mason with 2 skull fractures and subdural bleeding. It's impossible to say how different factors play out in individual cases, but we couldn't tell a story about CPS in America without mentioning that race plays a huge factor statistically across the country. Looking at these cases specifically, a baby brought to a hospital with subdural bleeding, that's bleeding between their skull and brain. Babies brought to a hospital with that type of injury, if they are Black, they are twice as likely to be referred for one of those abuse evaluations that we talked about, which feeds them into a system where by the time Black children in America turn 18, there's a 50% chance that they will have been the subject of a CPS investigation. It's a coin flip.
I can remember when the lady took my hand and she's fingerprinting me. And I thought, how many other people like me got locked up in the system? And actually, were locked up, on false charges. I remember thinking that, I'm probably going to go to prison. I can remember taking my photos, man, and I refused to look like a criminal. I didn't want to look mad or mean, so I kind of tried to put a little smile on my face, and I couldn't believe where I was at, Mike. It was like a dream, man.
Look, this is happening to anybody. Like one of the stories we wrote about, separate from the podcast, was about an ER physician in Milwaukee who brought his kid in with an injured clavicle to his own children's hospital and got referred to his team and lost custody of his daughter and faced criminal charges, even though 15 other medical experts said there was no evidence of abuse and the child abuse team made mistakes. So, and that's a white family. Anybody can come down this path, is what I've learned reporting this. But when you listen to the tape of what Lance and Sharday Butler went through and the way CPS interacted with them at times and the way their judge spoke to them in court, it's hard not to think, would you have talked the same way to a different family who didn't look like them?
How many families could you have included in this podcast other than the 2 that you focus on?
I've now talked with 50 or 60 across the country.
Yeah.
To be completely transparent with you, at the beginning of this, we knew we were going to make a podcast on this subject, and we had conversations about which stories to spotlight. And the power of Dylan and Melissa's story was all of that audio. And when you hear in episode 3 what it sounds like when those babies are being taken away from their mom and she doesn't know where they're going, and the toddler, like we heard, is trying to comfort her, she doesn't know what's going on. The thing I thought was, it's impossible to hear that and decide and think that policy is good. That policy of better safe than sorry is harmless. That tape and their story reveals there's a significant cost for taking children for even a couple days or a couple weeks.
So the moment the car pulled up, of course, Melissa and I run outside, and instantly we knew something was wrong.
And I open one side of the car, and Dylan goes around to the other side of the car to open it. And I opened the door to Charlotte's side, and it was not anything that I had dreamt of all day.
Mason, we get Mason out of the car first, and his face is swollen from crying so much. He's hoarse. He's so hoarse he doesn't even have a voice, and so he's trying to cry, but he can't even get any sound out.
And I'm like, well, how long did he have to cry like that before he became that hoarse?
And Charlotte, we get her out of the car, and here's my little girl. She's wearing somebody else's clothes. Not the clothes that we packed her. It's someone other kid's clothes. The dress that she's wearing is on backwards.
It's on inside out and backwards. She was almost yellowed in the face, and it's like she was so severely exhausted that she wasn't even cognitive of what was around her.
And to make matters worse, Charlotte had a black eye.
And I immediately fling around and I look at LeVar and I stare at him in the eyes and said, what happened to her? What did you do? Why does she have this?
You know, the true crime genre, podcasts are devoured as entertainment. You know, this is something for people to be distracted by and listen to and dip in and out of. But this is your freaking life, man. You had to live this. Is it weird? Just, I don't know, having it all out there, having your life there in this like perfectly produced 6-episode thing. What has that experience been like?
I always knew that I had to use it for good. It was the only way I could heal. So I didn't feel like there was any other answer other than to move forward on it. But I mean, it's weird when people reach out to you and you're like supposed to thank them for listening to your life.
Yes.
Like, yeah, they're like, oh, we finished Do No Harm. We're so glad you're together. And I'm like, thank you for listening.
Yeah.
To the worst days of my life. It's just really, it's definitely an odd experience.
It hasn't made me total full on helicopter, but to Mike's point, like you're just thinking about everything and every moment that these little kids are toddling around. I think I was at my in-laws I was at my parents while I was listening. And like Mike said, I was just like a little extra on top. I was just a little extra there. Is there a moment or a quote or a sound or an interview from your pod that you find particularly powerful that when Do No Harm is inevitably inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame, this would be playing in the background?
So I'm going to take us to a little bit of a darker place also in Shardae's story, just because I think that there's this moment in their case when, as Melissa talked about, Shardae and Lance are complying. They're complying as hard as they can comply, to the extent that they are actually, CPS is honed in on Lance as the likely abuser. And so they are pretending to not be together. And Shardae has, at CPS's urging, got her own apartment that Lance is paying for under the table. And CPS is saying, if you do all these things, we will get the kids at least to return to you because we don't think you hurt them. And so there's this hope that you see this glimmer of in this moment when Shardae is going to court separate from Lance, pretending to be apart from him. She's got her good lawyer now, and she's already been apart from her kids for 6 months, but they're going to come home because CPS said they would do it. And then she gets in there, and the CPS lawyer says, yes, we can return the kids. But then the judge reacts. Judge Devlin cut her off. Let's think outside the box a second. You can't tell from the court transcript, but Stephanie says the judge was practically yelling at her. Let's just say, hypothetically, the child went home and something else happened to the child, like got really hurt, okay? Your name wouldn't be in the newspaper. Mine would. The answer to everyone's question is no. It's 2 letters. N-O. For a moment, everyone in the courtroom was quiet. Lance hung his head in disbelief. Shardae sat silently as Judge Devlin dismissed her request and abruptly ended the hearing. All right, see ya. The whole thing lasted only about 10 minutes.
Melissa, you're welcome to plead the fifth on this one if you'd like, but if you'd like anything.
The part that sums it all up is when LeVar asks you to calm down, or me, not you. He asks me to calm down. And no, we're your parents. We are not going to calm down about our kids ever. Nobody should ever in any situation, not in an emergent situation they're taking them from you, but ever. They're your kids. Advocate for them as loudly and proudly as you can.
Yeah.
I just want to end by sharing the crisis text hotline that you share on your pod for anyone in need of a secure platform with trained counselors. Just text HOME, HOME, 2741-741. Guys, it's the last 5 minutes of our podcast. If you've listened to this podcast, you know that we do something on the back end of our podcast just for us, because no one's listening. No one listens to the last 5 minutes of any podcast. And so, because they've, finished whatever they were multitasking with. So it's just time for us here now to get whatever you'd like off your chest, not Lance or Charday related or CPS related or kids related. Talk about whatever you'd like. Talk about your day. Talk about your first crush, anything. No one is listening.
Yeah.
I'm just going to use my last 5 minutes to call out my dad and just elaborate on that situation that happened while we were visiting. I'm watching my daughter, and she's a pandemic baby. Okay. So it's just her mom and I at all times. We're just constantly following her around. She's so spoiled. I listen to podcasts and I chase her around. That's all that I do. And I can't turn that off just because my father is around or my grandparents are there. And so they're making fun of me the entire weekend we're there. They're totally doing the helicopter dad. Oh, here comes the helicopter. Oh, look, I think there's a helicopter following you, honey. This and that, making fun of me the entire time. Finally, I do let my guard down. I let up, let Poppy, just take care of her and watch her. But she's like, he's 100 years old and she's, just this little 14-month-old. So he's got no shot. I know what it takes every day keeping up with this thing, but whatever. I relax for a second and sure enough, she hits the corner of the table out back and gets a nice little gash on her eye. Not really a gash, but a healthy bruise. Does that, that second after they hit something where you're like, okay, is this going to be okay? Can we laugh this off? Or is an air raid siren about to, and then boom, sure enough, air raid siren, here she goes, starts crying. And all I could do was just yell, oh, helicopter dad, I'm a helicopter. Then it turns into that as opposed to, is my baby okay? Now I'm angry. And so I'm just, using this time to yell at my dad. Leave me alone. Let me parent how I want to parent if I want a helicopter.
I'm really sorry that the podcast made you this way.
I'm happy it did. So she's 18. I'm just going to be her shadow. So she's out of the house.
Now would be a really good time for any sort of do no harm wine company wanted to, go into operation.
That's good.
It's so stressful to be a parent, especially a helicopter one.
Do no harm wine. That's beautiful branding. I love it.
Well, so let me just unload something really quick. Because I'm just, we had a #1 in the country on Apple podcasts. I'm a journalist at NBC News. Like I feel like I've been fairly successful in my career. And the thing that I am most known for on the internet is fire ants. And I'm thinking of this because I'm sitting in my office and just staring at me is a photo of fire ants.
Fire ants.
For those who don't know, Houston, Texas is a swampy hell. And it's fire ants. If you've never encountered them, they are horrible. They are little tiny red ants that when they get on you, they bite and it inflicts serious pain. They're attacking. And during Hurricane Harvey, when I was new in Houston, I was out reporting for the newspaper, the Houston Chronicle, and I encountered the most horrifying thing I'd ever imagined. Floating in the floodwaters, floating mounds of fire ants, where they lock together and they climb on top of each other and they survive floods by
sacrificing the lower portion as a raft, as a little ant raft.
They float on each other, floating rand. Yes. And it blew my mind. Like people who live here, this is typical. You say, yeah, it's flooding in Houston and there are fire ants floating on it toward your house. And so I recorded a 12-second video and was just like the floating fire ants. Oh my, like just a little commentary. Is a colony of fire ants floating through floodwater. And it horrified the country. It went viral and it was viewed by like 20 million people. And I'm in the midst of a crisis, like covering a crisis and everything. And suddenly I'm getting messages from across the world. And the New York Times is contacting me to write a story about this fire ant mound. And NBC News, before I worked there, I wrote a story, and suddenly I'm getting calls from people all over the country. I just saw your tweet on the local news. It was picked up everywhere in the world, and I haven't been able to get away from this. Like I'm like, people mention fire ants. I'm the fire ant guy. And it's just frustrating because
because you've worked so hard. You've worked so hard on your podcasts and all of this, and the thing that you get the most clicks and likes for is stupid fire ants.
Yeah, I guess I feel like I'm in a constant war with fire ants ever since moving here, though. So this is just an escalation of that.
Sorry you're going through that. It reminds me of the Rat King here in New York. Do you know what the Rat King is? That's when that's when like rats are so dirty and feral that they get stuck to one another. Their tails get all stuck together.
Oh my God.
And it becomes one giant thing. It's no longer
God.
It's a rat king. It's just this frenzy of rat ball of like just dirty rats that are all stuck together, and fire ant mounds and rat kings.
Those are both horrifying.
Melissa, any rat kings or fire ant mounds to report on?
No, but did you? They swarm like the fire ants to protect the queen. So if it's just going to be around you the whole life, just you're a queen. That's it. They're just
I'm the queen ant.
You're just a queen ant.
They think you're their leader. I see what you're saying. Mike, Melissa, thank you for all the time you've given up today to talk to me, and thanks for sharing this pod, guys. Get it, subscribe, and like to it on all platforms, I imagine, wherever you get your podcast.
Everywhere.
Go get it. Go give it a listen. We're always looking for new suggestions on a fresh batch of pods, so please tell me what you're listening to and what hosts you'd like to hear from via thepodspodder.com or on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram at thepodspodder. Thank you. This has been Zach Robinos. The Pod Spotter is created by the Price Brothers, produced by Oink Inc. Radio, associate producer Tori Adams, and is recorded and produced at Baker Sound in Philadelphia.